All right, well, let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar on 7 things you should do to improve your user security on eduroam. Thank you so much for joining today's IAM Online. This is our monthly webinar focused on all things identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet2. My name is Jean Horszewski, the InCommon Academy Director, and I will be your host today. So let's get started. We're just going to do some introductions and then you'll hear from our guest speakers. We will be having a Q&A session and then we'll close up for today. So as we move along, I just want to let you know that we will be taking questions today and we're going to be using the Zoom Q&A function. So we do hope you'll be listening in and tuning in and sending us questions along the way, but we will address them in our Q&A segment later on. But we also have the chat feature available, and this is for group discussions. So just be sure that if you want to chat with everyone else here, that you are posting in chat. And be sure that you select everyone from the drop down as you see it in your chat box. We are recording today's session, so you will receive a link to today's recording via email, and it will also be posted on the InCommon website as well as our YouTube channel. So be sure to check out our website as well as your inbox. So now I am happy to pass the virtual baton over to our moderator, Derek Eiler, who is a principal systems engineer at Nevada System of Higher Education, and he's also an eduroam advisory committee member. Derek will introduce today's speakers as well as this important topic. So Derek, take it away.
Thanks, Jean. Hi, I'm your moderator, Derek Eiler, and as Jean said, I work for the Nevada System of Higher Education as Nevada's eduroam support org program lead, and I'm also a member of the Eduroam Advisory Committee, or EAC. If you're not familiar with the eduroam support orgs or the Eduroam Advisory Committee, you'll hear more about both very soon. In a moment, we'll hear a brief eduroam service growth update from Sarah Jeans, Internet2's Director of the Eduroam and InCommon Certificate Services. And then we'll hear some great practical advice for improving your user security on eduroam from Josh Howlett and Margaret Cullen from the Internet2 eduroam US operations team. These topics are all very timely as the EAC is working to develop some baseline expectations for eduroam operators in the US. Similar to what has already been done in the InCommon Federation, our goal is to elevate both the quality of service and the level of trust across the eduroam community. Stay tuned for more communication around eduroam baseline expectations in the coming months. And if you plan to attend the Internet2 Technology Exchange in Boston this December, come find an EAC member and share your eduroam thoughts with us. All right, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah and Josh.
Thanks very much. If Josh doesn't mind sharing the slides as well. I really appreciate the intro, Derek, and lots of good elements to highlight there. And thanks for the opening words, Jean. I'm going to take maybe the next 10 minutes and do a quick service growth update just to level set us all on where eduroam is and where eduroam is going. Just before we get into the practical elements and deep dive. Hopefully you've got your technologist hat on. Josh has some really good slides coming up. So next slide, Josh. Excellent. So this is probably review for most everybody, but just because this is an audience we only jump into a few times a year, just an update on what is eduroam. So as a reminder, eduroam sits alongside the InCommon Web Federation as a federated access to wireless as a service built upon the Radius protocol. We participate in the global federation, and those users are ultimately authenticating back to the home organization. Internet2 and InCommon are responsible for facilitating those requests between the hotspot and then back to the home university. Next up. Thank you. So how are things really done? Within the eduroam service, I serve on a global governance committee, but really this is a community-powered service with Internet2 operating it. So We have a great advisory committee for the service. As Derek mentioned, he is a member of that service, a well-tenured member. That service advisory committee is then chaired by Brett Bieber at the University of Nebraska and is vice chaired by Jeff Egley at UETN. As Derek mentioned, there is an ongoing working group, as you see, around baseline expectations. And common baseline expectations were and continue to be a great success, and we thought we'd emulate some of that success. So what you'll hear Josh speak to today reflects a lot of EAC thinking as well, and items that Josh is able to highlight for this working group as elements that might appear in the first level of eduroam baseline expectations, or more likely subsequent levels of baseline expectations. Next, please. So I get this question a lot. What is eduroam and what is internet doing or offering? That I really think about it in two separate flavors. There's a higher education and research flavor. Those are schools that typically are running at a university or college, or maybe a research organization. Those folks interact and engage directly with Internet 2. They submit help desk tickets straight to the Internet 2 eduroam team, and those folks are supported, and the offering is delivered directly by Internet 2. We've worked very closely over the last 5+ years now with folks in the state-based support space. Those in particular being folks who support K-12 museums and libraries. And those individuals and those organizations deliver eduroam out to their constituents. So that's K-12, that's elementary, middle, and high schools, museums, libraries. They also interact and engage with their local internet service providers as well, and work on establishing hotspots. So it's a very important relationship for these two facets. But with the Internet 2 and in common teams, we're working with higher education research directly. And then we work with the eduroam support organizations to engage with those K-12 museums and libraries folks. Next slide, please. So these are mostly for consumption kind of after the presentation's over, but I wanted to make sure we did a check-in and a level set on kind of where we are with subscribers today. eduroam has a significant number of subscribers today, and this is specifically in the US. We also have over 3,400 service locations, so those are places where eduroam is available out in the community in the US and other associated tribal nations as well throughout the US footprint today. Next slide. And then I mentioned those support organizations. We have 7 full participants as support organizations supporting K-12 museums and libraries. And if you happen to catch the announcement last week, we just announced 2 new on-rampers into the program. They are doing an initial pilot in 2024, and then they'll be up and roll into full participation into 2025. That is Merit Network in Michigan and the Learning Network of Minnesota in Minnesota. So congrats to those 2 organizations. We're happy to have you on board. Next, please. So why are we talking about this now? Why are we looking at the growth of the eduroam service? Big factor is eduroam service is growing and changing. The eduroam support organizations are driving some really interesting use cases onto eduroam. That traffic looks a little differently. The way they engage with folks is a little different. It's also ultimately driving more people on, and eduroam is most impacted by not only more people, but more devices that people bring, since it's the engagement with eduroam is largely driven on the device itself. So we're seeing this great growth trajectory. More people are subscribing to the service, more organizations, more people are using more devices on the service, and we want to be really aware that that's happening. We talked about a presentation a couple years ago about the next 1,000 subscribers. We're pretty much there. We're just about at that next 1,000 subscribers mark that we talked about a couple years ago in presentations, and we need to be thinking about the next 2,000 or the next 3,000 groups of folks, especially as more and more states come online, state-based eduroam support organizations come online, and in particular, some of the larger states. We have to be aware that we have a great diversity in size, complexity, support structures within states. And if one of the largest states in the country comes on board, Michigan and Minnesota are both quite large states. What does that look like as they continue to roll this out to their constituents? Next slide, please. So we did a bit of projecting, and in particular, I can't take credit for this. This is Josh's projection, but based on the traffic we've seen on the service over the last few years and the way that the eduroam support organizations are growing, what does it look like? And you'll see higher ed continues to grow in the blue, but there is a massive growth in K-12 organization authentications on the service we projected out through 2029, based on what we're seeing. And we need to be prepared for that. We're already working on that, but there's also things that you all can be doing to help us prepare for that and ultimately make your users, especially as we bring more folks online, more secure and more privacy preserving in their engagement with the service. And then last slide for me, Josh. Just wanted to give a quick update on all the things that the team, the eduroam advisory committee, is working on today to make the service better and to really look into that future. So as Derek mentioned, we're doing some community consultations, engaging with folks in the support organizations about large deployments. What does it look like if you bring on an entire city? What does it look like? How does the traffic change if you bring on university students and they're hopping onto hotspots deployed by the local school district? Those are big things and big changes that impact the service. Definitely, we're doing some low-level work on the service as well, on the technical backend, on the core, to make sure that it stays stable, that it scales well, that it functions really well to continue to keep up. The scaling testbed is really important. We actually have an environment that's being stood up specifically to see what happens when we hit those authentication numbers that we expect in 2029. How does the service perform? Are there scaling bugs we don't know about in some of our core technologies or in things we've written that we expected it to work for 10 million or 100 million authentications, but not 200 million or 250 million authentications? That's really important. And then something that's been a long time coming and the team has really been working on it. Turns out it's really tough to deploy individual logging for folks, and it's even tougher to add more insights onto those logging details. So we've been adding some additional detail in the log viewer behind the scenes. Hope to get that deployed out to folks soon. And we're also taking a strong look and starting the work on overhauling our reporting engine. You all, I know, like the reports, but we wanted to tune it a bit on how you're receiving it, how it might look to consume those, and ultimately how we're serving the eduroam support organizations a little better with those reports. So that wraps my section. As a reminder, if you have questions for me, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box in Zoom, and we will make sure to field those in the Q&A section. And with that, I will hand it over to Josh.
My name is Josh Howlett. I'm a member of the Internet to eduroam US operations team. I'll be giving this presentation myself. The presentation was developed with my colleague, Margaret Cullen. We thought it would be a bit simpler if I just presented the content today. My own background, I've got nearly 25 years experience in wireless networks. I worked with the original team that developed the eduroam service in Europe and launched the UK eduroam service in 2006, so nearly 20 years ago. So without further ado, we'll move on to the presentation. So as I just mentioned, eduroam has been around for quite some time, two decades. And at the time, the concept was very simple. It was to address what was then a very niche edge case of the very small number of users who had laptops and access to Wi-Fi networks, being able to provision them with access to the network. And that was very niche at the time. But obviously, the situation is very different today. Most people have a Wi-Fi capable device. And today we see over 1 million users in the US connecting to eduroam at some service provider across the country from 1.5 million devices every month. So we're now talking really substantial scale. And not only that, but it's also increasingly the preferred way of connecting users on campus as well. We see universities consolidate their potentially multiple SSIDs onto a single eduroam SSID. So it's turning into effectively the de facto form of connection to Wi-Fi networks on campuses in many places. But what we often see with eduroam implementations is that once the project to implement the service is done, people move on. And so implementations are not necessarily keeping pace with the evolving landscape. So the purpose of this presentation is to just suggest some very practical steps that institutions can take to enhance your security posture of the service to protect your institution and your users. This is going to focus purely on eduroam specific issues. So we're not going to look at any of your vendor equipment, for example. All of the security practices, that are best appropriate to that, to your vendor equipment will be documented by your vendor. So obviously consult your vendor documentation for any wireless specific issues. So there are, broadly speaking, 5 threats to your eduroam service that we're going to cover today. The first is identification of users. So in many cases, it's very trivial to identify who users are on the network. Parallel to that, it's also surprisingly easy to track users as well, which is to say their physical location. That could be inferred from information in radius packets. Third, there's also the risk of theft of user credentials, where user credentials are stolen from misconfigured devices. Fourth, there's a possibility of unauthorized elevation of network access, where users are given inappropriate access to the network on the basis of inadvisable use of dynamic VLAN allocation. And finally, we sometimes see unauthorized access to other services. So this is often just a configuration error. People conflate the authorization policies for eduroam and other services that also happen to use radius on campus. And again, this can have unexpected outcomes. So these are the seven things that we're going to work through in the rest of this presentation. There is one thing that I'd strongly encourage you not to do, which is to wait for RADSEC. RADSEC is obviously something that is becoming well known. It's a significant improvement to the security of radius, but it has surprisingly little impact on the security of eduroam. And I'll talk through why that's the case towards the end of this presentation. But that is one of the key messages behind this presentation is don't wait for RADSEC. It's not going to solve many of your security problems. There are better ways of addressing these problems. So the first is to use anonymous identities. The EAP identity, which is the identity of your user, is expressed in this format, username at realm. This is sort of legacy. Today, EAP method authentications put the username within a secure tunnel and only the realm is used for the routing. Unfortunately, despite that being legacy, nonetheless, almost all products still put the username in the EAP identity. And this field is just sent unencrypted over the network. So you can see here a Wireshark dump where a user's identity, I've obviously redacted it, is in clear text. And there's nothing that can be done about that. The better approach is to configure an anonymous identity in the user's device. Almost all devices, pretty much all devices will support that. It's just unfortunately the case that the default is not to use the anonymous identity, which is frustrating. Today, we only see about 4% of identities in the US using the anonymous identity. In the EU, it's a bit better at 10%. So this is by far and away the easiest way of improving security on your eduroam deployment is to use a provisioning tool to configure your users' devices with the anonymous identity. So a tool such as the eduroam account. This graph shows how the prevalence of anonymous identities has changed over the last couple of years, with US growing a few percentage points, EU a little bit further ahead, but then we have these places of excellent practice, like in France, that have now achieved nearly 45% prevalence of anonymous identities. So there is, there is definitely room for improvement. The second is not to send location-based attributes. Network access infrastructure leaks location information very badly. So they will send normally 3 attributes: the NAS identifier attribute, the called station ID, which is the access point's MAC address, and then also vendor-specific attributes that vendors often use to provide quite specific location information. So for example, here we have an Aruba access point, which is located in the Students' Union in the first floor bathroom. That is a very specific location. And that location will be sent with the EAP identity that we saw in the previous slide. So it's very easy to correlate a user with a location. Again, these attributes are sent unencrypted. With most equipment, it's not even that easy to turn these attributes off. So very often you just have to use values that won't have any meaning outside of the campus. Sending the information serves no purpose. It's potentially exposing the location of your visitors. And it's also leaking information about your network infrastructure, information that you may not want other people to know. So a few recommendations: use a packet capture tool to audit what your devices are sending. Remove or sanitize any residual unwanted attributes. And then in that way, you can minimize the information that's leaving the campus. The third is to use secure authentication methods. So the good news is that everyone, without exception, is using security methods to authenticate their users. There's a couple of qualifications to this. There are still quite a lot of users out there who are still nonetheless attempting to use insecure methods, even if those aren't supported by their institution. That number, as you can see in the graph here, has diminished over time, but it's still quite significant. So roughly 100 realms we see every month. And there are still over 30 IDPs authenticating raw EAP MS Chat v2, which is an old, pretty insecure EAP authentication method. That's almost certainly a misconfiguration, because EAP MS Chat v2 is normally tunneled within something like EAP PEEP or EAP TTLS, where it's perfectly safe because it's protected by TLS. Which brings us on to this other aspect, which is that if the TLS tunnel that is protecting the credentials, so the EAP MS Chat credentials, for example, if that tunnel isn't secure, then those credentials within the tunnel, like the EAP MS Chat credentials, are vulnerable to being attacked. The most common issue that we see is organizations publicly documenting trust on first use for eduroam, for EAP PEEP and EAP TTLS. This is often convenient because it reduces the effort that's needed to provision devices with the correct configuration. So for example, the service certificate that will be presented by the Radius server, but it is creating a significant weakness because users have devices that will just be handing out their credentials to anything claiming to be eduroam without authenticating that entity that they're giving the credentials to is actually authorized to receive them. Something else that sometimes comes up is multi-factor authentication. Unfortunately, this isn't something that's really practical with eduroam or Wi-Fi in general. If you've got a business requirement not to use the user's primary credential, so for example, their Active Directory password with eduroam, then issue a secondary credential instead. So for example, a certificate or something else that isn't the primary credential. So just a couple of recommendations. Ensure that your Radius server is only negotiating secure EAP authentication. So just double check that you're not offering EAP MS Chat v2 outside of a PEEP or TTLS tunnel. Use a provisioning tool, again, as we saw earlier, to configure your users' devices securely. Ensure that your users can connect to eduroam before they roam. That's key because it reduces the probability that they will then just attempt to connect to something claiming to be eduroam once they leave campus. So once they've done it once securely on campus, they can then roam, safe in the knowledge that their devices will only ever connect to an authorized eduroam service provider. And finally, last but not least, educate your users not to trust on first use in general. This is just bad practice. It's a practice that we've managed to get users to stop doing in the web context. You know, we no longer encourage users just to click through, trust this certificate. But this is still something that users are doing today in a wireless context. And we should really be discouraging them from doing that. Fourth, review your public key infrastructure. This really sort of, again, comes from the previous point. The tunnel that is established between the device and the home authentication server is protected with certificates most of the time. So it's critical that those certificates and the configuration around them is secure. There are, broadly speaking, two approaches that you can take with your public key infrastructure. The first, and this is generally speaking the right one for 95% of campuses, is to use a commercial certificate authority. So such as the in-common certificate service. You can just easily obtain an appropriate service certificate from the in-common certificate service and use it with your Radius server. If you do this, the only thing you need to make sure is that your device's eduroam profiles are configured to require the name that is associated with that certificate. The reason for that is that anyone could actually get a certificate from a commercial CA and not necessarily be trusted. So by ensuring that the devices require the name ensures that they only give the credentials to the authorized server. The other option is to use a private CA. This means that you don't have to use a commercial product and you don't have to provide the configuration about the expected certificate name. Certificate can also have a long expiry date, which potentially makes things easier for certificate rollover. But this again comes with other configuration headaches, which is why we don't tend to recommend it unless you have a lot of experience already operating a private CA. So if you're comfortable operating private CA, this is something you can do. If you're not comfortable operating a private CA, just use a commercial product, such as a certificate from the in-common certificate service. So, number 5, don't send or consume VLAN attributes. Dynamic VLAN assignment is an incredibly useful tool. Many campuses use it today, but it does have its weaknesses when used in an eduroam context. And the key thing is don't try and use dynamic VLAN assignment to configure another institution's infrastructure or allow another institution to configure your own network by using these attributes. So today, about 3% of eduroam authentications include these VLAN attributes, and really they shouldn't be sent at all, because the VLAN attributes, typically speaking, have got no meaning outside of the context of a particular campus. So no one else can use this information. Unfortunately, most service providers probably aren't stripping these attributes on ingress, because Radius servers' default behavior is just to permit all attributes. And so these 3% of eduroam authentications with these VLAN attributes, those VLAN attributes are probably ending up on edge equipment. So the consequences of sending and consuming VLAN attributes include users can be assigned to a non-existent VLAN, in which case the user doesn't get service. The user may be assigned to a VLAN without DHCP or external routing. Again, the user doesn't get service. These aren't necessarily security related issues, but they are, they obviously do have an impact on the quality of the service that's being provided to the user. And this is something that we do see happen every now and again. More seriously, users may be assigned a privileged VLAN completely by accident. And you're also exposing information about your own network configuration if you're sending these attributes out onto the eduroam network, which again is not something that you probably want to do. Also, there's a potential attack vector here, which is that an attacker in control of an eduroam IDP could assign a device to a specific VLAN on your network. So that this attack does require that the attacker has got control of an eduroam IDP so that they can issue some credentials and provide the VLAN attributes. But it does mean that they can then get onto a privileged network if they know the VLAN identifier for one of those networks, and that network is being trunked out onto the wireless infrastructure. It is perfectly legitimate to allocate visitors to different VLANs depending on their affiliation. So you might see a request come in for a user from another institution, and it's perfectly legitimate to place that, to place that user using dynamic VLAN assignment onto some other VLAN separate from a VLAN that your own eduroam users might use. But if you're going to try and do that across campuses, and there are very few, I think, cases where this is necessary, use some other attribute to signal that. So for example, the username attribute, which includes the realm. So in that way, you can identify if a user is coming from a particular institution, so they should be placed onto a specific VLAN, or the configuration token attribute, which is an attribute that just allows you to send along a token, like an integer, and when the radius server sees that integer value, they know to apply some form of policy, such as assign some VLAN to that user. So it is quite interesting how many of these identifiers we see operationally. There's just a selection here of VLAN identifiers that we scooped off the top-level radius servers a few days ago. You may recognize some VLAN identifiers for your own network there. So to avoid this issue, it's quite simple. If you're not doing dynamic VLAN allocation, and not everyone is, just make sure that you disable it on your wireless LAN controllers. If you are using it, make sure that you filter these attributes on ingress, or overwrite those values with the values that you want to use internally. So, number 6, harden your radius configuration. There's quite a few things here. I'll work through them one by one. So the first is to use strong radius secrets, and don't reuse them across your radius clients. Unfortunately, this is a practice that I think is fairly widespread, and it's understandable why people do it, because it's laborious having to generate a new radius secret for every radius client. However laborious that may be, it is significantly less effort than having to do it in a hurry. If you discover that one radius secret that you use for all of your radius clients has been compromised. So it is worth investing the effort into doing it. And the good news is that while it is a bit laborious to do it the once, you only have to do it the once. There's no need to revoke and reissue secrets to your hardware. Don't assume that information from the TLRS can be trusted. The reason for that is that there is no filtering. So we sort of saw that on the previous slide with VLAN attributes. We don't filter out those VLAN attributes, we just let them through. And there are other attributes that we just let through as well. The top level radius servers are transparent by design. But as I said before, radius server products also default to permit all for radius clients. So anything that we send through, your radius servers will by default almost certainly just be sending through back to your radius clients. So make sure that you're applying policy to packets on ingress to remove any unnecessary attributes, such as the VLAN attributes. And on a following slide, I'm going to list out the attributes that you should be permitting for eduroam to work, and everything else you can strip. Again, on egress, get rid of anything that isn't needed. So we've talked about the VLAN attributes, we've talked about the location attributes, which shouldn't leave your campus. It's also useful to discard badly formed usernames. So for example, usernames that lack a realm. We will discard those anyway, and if we see a lot of those come in, then there's the possibility that we may impose rate limiting on your institution to avoid service disruption, which does happen from time to time. We see badly behaving devices sending very large numbers of these badly formed requests, and to manage that flow, we impose rate limiting. If you use Radius for other services, so for other SSIDs, besides eduroam, ensure that the policies are being evaluated contextually. So for example, make sure that your internal SSID, if you're broadcasting one, won't permit eduroam authentication against it. It's obvious, but it's surprising how common this is. So people just accidentally allowing eduroam authentication against other SSIDs. There's a sort of an interesting, another interesting case of this, which is that Radius is used for various other applications besides Wi-Fi authentication. So Radius is used for VPN concentrators, web applications, captive portals, authentication to router and switch infrastructure, and so forth. And we do see, we have seen cases where the Radius configuration on the campus is such that a user with an eduroam credential can get access, just authenticate to, for example, a VPN concentrator because of the lack of contextual policy evaluation. So it's just a matter of picking through your policies carefully and making sure that they're being evaluated in such a way that the outcome is in line with your expectation. If you've got Radius clients overseas, ensure that they're connected to a trusted Radius infrastructure. This again goes back to the fact that these attributes, like the VLAN attributes, can be modified in flight by an intermediate proxy without you knowing about it. We have American campuses, for example, over here in London, in the UK, and those campuses will connect to the UK service, and that's a very good configuration. It makes things more performant because there's less packets going, less round trips across the Atlantic. But there may be cases where you don't have that level of trust in the Radius infrastructure. If that's the case, you may want to consider connecting your Radius clients directly back to a Radius server in the US. So recommendations: use strong Radius secrets and don't reuse them, filter unnecessary attributes, review how your Radius server is evaluating policies, and consider how your Radius clients overseas are connecting to the Radius infrastructure. These are the recommended radius attributes that you should use. I'm not going to talk through these now. You can review these at your leisure after the presentation. The final thing you should do is to design for high availability. A robust infrastructure is much better prepared to weather security-related issues. One of the first things that people think about when they think about high availability is load balancing. And unfortunately, load balancing is possible, but it's tricky and there's quite a few gotchas. I won't go through the gotchas in this presentation. That's probably a whole new presentation by itself. But we have got guidance available for load balancing on the internet too at your own website. So if you are load balancing today, I recommend you take a look at that. You should consider the long-term growth of eduroam. Sarah spoke to the fact that the service is growing very strongly. We're seeing growth of authentications of about 11% per annum. So you want to consider that in your capacity planning. And make sure that you have headroom in your capacity planning for unexpected events. So every now and again, a new university will come online. If that university is in your locality, suddenly you'll have thousands of new students potentially connecting to your campus. So just make sure that you've got headroom in your capacity to cater for those sorts of cases. For identity providers, make sure that your whole authentication stack is performing well, not just the radius servers. So for example, your Active Directory and everything else. And service providers, as I mentioned earlier, very occasionally devices will generate very large volumes of requests. These will be poorly behaving devices. These requests sometimes come in at hundreds of requests per second. So make sure that you're in a position, you've got tools to detect and manage these sorts of events locally, or again, we may have to impose rate limiting, which will disrupt legitimate traffic. So a few recommendations: apply standard architectural practices for high availability, review the performance of your authentication stack. I said at the start of the presentation that you shouldn't wait for AdSec because it isn't going to have as much impact on eduroam security as you might think. The reasons for this are spelt out here. I won't walk through this in detail, but essentially identification of users isn't protected because the e-transaction happens before the packets reach the radius infrastructure. Theft of user credentials is not improved because RadSec doesn't really play into that part of the transaction. Tracking of users is partially improved because attributes are being encrypted between radius client and radius server, but they're still visible to intermediate proxies. And RadSec has nothing to say about unauthorized elevation or access to networks and other services because that's a policy question. It's not about the transport. So these are the things that we suggest you do. This is a list of the action items that you can consider doing back at your campus. Which brings me to the end of the presentation.
All right. Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you, Sarah, also for sharing your insights with the community. We're going to open it up to questions now. Just a quick reminder that if you still have questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A button in Zoom. It's a lot easier to follow than jumping between that and the chat. That said, there are some questions and some chat topics. So I'll open it up with this. Paul asked, as a roaming operator, should I start stripping VLAN attributes for the country that they are a roaming operator for?
I'll just say that we don't do it, and we don't do it for a reason, which is that we want to maintain the transparency of the packets going through our proxy as much as possible. And there are a number of reasons why that's good. One of them is for those of you who have heard about the blast radius attack, it makes sure that we don't strip off all the attributes that happen to be after the message authenticator, which can open you up to attack. But Also, the, we don't actually know for sure what all the attributes are being used for, right? Or what they might have a future use for. Things in the past, boxes in the middle that have stripped things have made it very hard to innovate in protocols. So if we invent new attributes, would we strip all of those? Would we not strip any of those? It's just, it has a tendency, like with NAP boxes and other types of middle boxes, to stifle innovation if middle boxes do things like strip things they don't understand. So we, to the extent possible, try to be transparent. We do add some attributes for loop prevention, and there's something else we do that we add an attribute for, but now I can't remember what it is. But those are for our own use, right? But that doesn't take away anything that was meant to be end to end.
All right. Anything else from the panel on that one? All right. We'll go on to the next question. So Josh mentioned earlier that we should not wait for RADSEC. That was the last bullet point in his advice to us. There was a comment in the chat, though, that RADSEC TLS/PSK, pre-shared key, should make things easier. Josh or Margaret, is there anything you want to share on that topic and how it may or may not improve user security in eduroam?
I work in the IETF, where I'm the chair of the Radius Extensions Working Group, and that group's primary task is standardizing EAP over DTLS or TLS, EAP radius over DTLS and TLS, so that we can have a more secure roaming service in eduroam, and also so that on-campus stuff that has to go over multiple hops will be more secure. And obviously that's a really valuable thing to do. I do think it will make some things much more secure, because the traffic between the hops can be encrypted. And if you control a whole network like you do for on-campus authentication, you can know that it's encrypted end to end because you control all the hops. It doesn't help you as much with something like eduroam, because it will only promise that all the hops are encrypted when everyone runs RADSEC, right? Otherwise, if you picture, if we brought up RADSEC as an option today and 10 universities got on it, anytime they sent to any of the other 1,000+ universities, it would get just translated into regular radius without them being able to do anything to stop that. And then, it will come back to them and it would be in RADSEC and it would look like it was secure, but actually everything Josh just talked about would be exposed during those radius hops. So everything we're listing here should be done whether you're using RADSEC or not. And using RADSEC, if it does come to the point where you're using it end to end, could certainly add another layer of protection for your users by encrypting most of the information that they, like this certificate information Josh talked about, that's not encrypted today unless you have TLS 1.3 would be encrypted. So it would be an improvement, but it doesn't make any of what Josh just said unnecessary.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. The next question we'll take, how heavy of a load would you think these steps would be for a networking team? As a member of our security team, I want to avoid placing a huge burden on them. So knowing which ones would disproportionately burden their team would be a help. So in other words, how hard is this to do and how should we prioritize those recommendations? I think I'd throw that at Josh, who's muted.
Yeah, I was hoping Margaret might want to take that one again. That is a hard question.
There's two answers, right? I mean, some of these things are easy. They're flipping a configuration switch, your network, your radius infrastructure. A whole bunch of them involve helping your users do better. And those are vary in difficulty based on what you already have for infrastructure regarding things like provisioning. If your users are, we saw recently an example where you go to a QR code when you get to campus. It was Josh's child. So when you go to campus, you have a QR code, you go to that, it helps you configure eduroam. If you have that kind of deal, then basically you can help them configure an eduroam that has a certificate that doesn't have their email address as their user identifier, and that uses anonymous outer identities and has a good CA list so that it checks the certificate properly. If you don't have one of those, getting one of those is not trivial. If your users are actually going in and configuring it themselves, I guess you probably provide them with some kind of help script. And you could try to have the script say, on the Mac, click this box so you get an outer identity. But that's probably a little more work, because your help desk would have to walk people through those steps. It really depends on how much infrastructure you already have today to configure your users, I think. Can you add any color to that?
I would add, I mean, on the action plan, on the final slide in the slide deck, I did try and structure that in such a way that the items on the left were more readily addressable. So for example, a lot of it, that is user documentation, for example. And then as you move to the right, they become progressively more work. So in the rightmost column, there is review the performance of your authentication stack. That's probably quite a significant project. So I would encourage people to work from the left and move to the right on that slide.
Great.
Yeah, and the big thing to remember is, a small improvement is still an improvement. So even if all you do is get, say, anonymous IDs in there, you'd be making a huge leap in your users not being tracked to a particular bathroom on a particular level of a particular building. Okay, because that's not safe. If I can go to that address, if I'm an IT person at that university, and check out that person's LinkedIn and then decide I want to go stalk that person, this is not okay. All right. So, if we can at least prevent that level of being able to take a particular, outwardly used personal identifying information and track that person to a particular location, that would be a huge improvement in user security.
Great, good points. We only have a few more minutes left for questions, so I'm going to bundle a couple together. We did have a couple questions and comments about some tooling that may be unfamiliar to US eduroam subscribers, specifically the eduroam visitor access system and get eduroam. And some may be familiar with the get eduroam app for deploying your CAP profile to your mobile devices. But there's more to get eduroam, the get eduroam name, than just the app. Would anyone like to give a real brief rundown on those two tools?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Derek. So if you're not familiar with it, AVA or EVA, eduroam visitor access, and get eduroam are two sets of tools that are out in the ecosystem of eduroam globally. Eduroam visitor access is specifically helpful for onboarding folks who might need temporary credentials. So it creates an ability to administer temporary or one-time use credentials with a timer on them. It also facilitates creation of things like QR codes and video display screens that might end up in conference rooms, so that those folks can gain access to the eduroam wireless, but still be in compliance because they're staying local to that access. And it eliminates, in a lot of cases, the need for another SSID for guest access or other management flows. The other offering is get eduroam. So as Derek mentioned, there's a bunch of pieces to it. There is the clients themselves, which are maintained and published by some colleagues in Europe into the App Store and Play Store for Android and Apple devices, as well as a management interface and a backend certificate store. Specifically, get eduroam manages the configuration of clients on mobile devices and other desktop devices, as well as creation of pseudo credentials, as Josh had mentioned, secondary credentials, specifically for eduroam that are different than a user's single sign-in credentials, but leverages the Incumbent Federation and international credential federations, web federations, as well as those discovery services to have a user find themselves, get signed in, validate they are who they say they are, and get the proper configuration set up for the home campus eduroam implementation. Both of those technologies are out there. Some folks are trialing them, using them. They don't have a significant adoption in the US, but it is something that was evaluated by the eduroam advisory committee a few years back. And both of those solutions looked like good options in their respective use cases. So worth checking all out selfishly. If folks on this call are particularly interested in something like Get eduroam and doing something more broadly at a national level with Get eduroam, reach out to me at help@incommon.org, and we will collate those and collect those and send that feedback back to the advisory committee and take a look at next steps there.
Great. And it looks like we are out of time for questions, unfortunately. Keep them flowing to us, help@incommon.org, or any other channels you have to communicate with us. We'd be happy to get to you on those. I'll pass it back over to Jean.
Well, many, many thanks to you, Sarah and Josh and Margaret and Derek, for sharing these very important updates and insights. I know there was a few more comments in the chat, especially about whether or not some of these recommendations were going to be on a webpage. So if you have a chance to answer those while we have some remaining minutes in the chat, that'd be great. But we just want to thank all of you for attending today and for posting questions and just tuning in. We very much appreciate you being here. And before we sign off, you're going to encounter a 4-question survey about today's program as you exit. So please do provide your feedback. We want to know what you think. If you have any specific feedback, you can direct it to me if you have some comments. If you have ideas about future IAM online webinars, please let us know that too, whether it's a topic or maybe you want to be a speaker. And we do invite you to join us on November 20th for our next IAM Online. This one is going to be all about balancing security and ease of use. So if you are experiencing social engineering attacks, you might want to tune into this one as well. But I do want to point out that starting now, as in after this webinar, we are moving to a new webinar registration process. You will be asked to register for each and every one of them going forward. And this helps ensure that you're only signing up for the ones that you're really interested in. So please keep an eye out for your inbox as well as our website for how to do that. But please join us again. Again, this event was recorded, so you will see the recordings and the slides on our website. So please check back and make sure that you find them there. And once again, a special thanks to Jennifer and the Internet 2 team who make this monthly event happen. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and we will see you next month.